We are streaming indeed. All right, welcome everyone. We have an exciting seminar for you today. We have two speakers. Both will be discussing various aspects of low latitude aurora. We'll start with Liz McDonald, and Liz will be talking to us about her research on Steve. Please take it away. And a quick reminder before we go is that, as usual, we're holding the questions until the completion of the second talk. It's all yours, please.
Do you want to introduce the second speaker too, or?
I will introduce Claire right
Okay.
after you
All right.
go ahead.
Okay, let me share my screen. Thanks everybody for coming out. How does that look and sound? It's not in full screen mode. Is that sharing correctly?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Welcome everyone. I'm excited to give you a quick talk about Steve today and largely an overview of work that I've done related to Steve that will flow nicely into Claire's talk, hopefully, and a good discussion for this group. Um, I'll keep going. I'll keep moving quickly here. I definitely want to acknowledge the many people who've made this possible, our funders, as well as all of the participants all over the world, and definitely not going to do all of that justice today. So, just going to give a quick overview of some of the aspects. And if you want a longer version of the talk, I did give a MOS Magnetosphere online seminar a couple years ago that this is largely the quick condensed version of. Most people here know me, but for those of you that don't, I am a NASA Goddard employee and I have a history of magnetosphere, ionosphere, experimental plasma measurements and coupling. But I am largely going to talk about my work with the citizen science project Aurorasaurus and how that led into Steve for this presentation. Aurorasaurus is a participatory science project that began um, way back in like 2011 um, and has led to um, alerts for people when they can see aurora, improvements for the modeling in the data at scale. And actually, this slide is out of date because we have more than 25,000 reports. And we've really built a community over the years, and our the community of people on the ground seeing aurora and seeing something unusual. So that's where Steve comes in. The aurora is, of course, not just a pretty picture, but data that are useful in our field, which is pretty data starved. If you're not familiar with citizen science or participatory science, there's a good book recommendation here, but it can work on a very massive scale and generate high quality data, and there are um, data quality controls built in, and it's a great way to have the public engaged in science co-researching with us, which is very powerful. Folks are welcome to join our project. We often collaborate with scientists and the public, and we have various ways to do that. So you can reach out to me if you're interested in that. NASA is definitely encouraging citizen science and has been for several years. And I've been a part of that as well. And then I have also been a part of, and should say that I am a part of the MAX team with citizen science, especially, which is interested in satellite auroral imaging. But for this seminar, there's no politics, no conspiracy theories. So we're all a happy magnetosphere, ionosphere family. Um, and yeah, all happy to talk about the science. A little bit more about citizen science at NASA, just to state that it is proposable whenever it's appropriate for the science, and that there are a variety of projects across the whole Science Mission Directorate. And if anybody is interested in that, I can talk later about it. But we're here to talk about Steve and meet Steve. Most of you have probably met Steve at this point, since it's been several years of discussion and recognition of this. I would call it the optical manifestation of an extreme subaraural ion drift. It's one type of subaraural arc. The nice kind of mauve structure here, seen in a picture from Canada, while the aurora is further to the north. Steve is named Steve because of a movie called Over the Hedge, in which this little character of the squirrel, Hammy, says, let's just call it Steve, and is talking about, in the movie, a hedge, but in our Aurora community and the Alberta Aurora Chasers, who contributed a lot of early observations of this thing that we didn't know what it was, they said, let's just call it Steve. And I was fortunate to meet the comic book artist a couple years ago, T. Lewis, who's pictured here. And he's excited about Steve too. So, Steve has many different forms, looks very different in all of these extremely beautiful observations by photographers and people with their cameras really were able to capture something that we had not appreciated in the subaraural zone. And talk more about that. So, yes, Steve, in its most basic, common attributes, it's narrow, it's east to west. So you can tell these pictures are all taken with different orientations. It's a pre-midnight phenomena largely. Can last 20 minutes to an hour, maybe a little longer. And it's pretty faint. To the naked eye, it's quite gray, but you can pick up all this color with commercial cameras and even cell phones nowadays. And the color is purple, mauve, but also sometimes there's these transient green features that we'll talk more about. Um, the first modern scientific paper on what we now call Steve is this paper in Science Advances from 2018, in which what we identified was the extreme subauroral ion drift. And Steve got the acronym Strong Thermal Emission Velocity Enhancement. There were citizen scientists on the ground across Alberta and Saskatchewan who took observations. That then led to observations being found in the optical cameras across across Canada, fielded by the University of Calgary, and a conjunction with the SWARM satellite flying at like 500 kilometers. And what SWARM sees it is a very strong subaraural ion drift, which has heated electrons, more than 5 kilometer per second flow to the west, um, and really happening in the density trough between the subaraural region and the auroral region. Um, let's see. So, subaraural ion drifts are common. They've been seen by satellites for 40 years, but we just never knew pretty much that the strongest flows were actually creating visible light. So that was the new discovery there. Um, uh, the statistics, there's a really nice paper by He from 2014 that looks at the statistics of subaraural ion drifts and where they occur. And that is a good reference there, as well as some of the observations, how they look in like DMSP observations here as well. All right. Then there was a lot of rapid progress on Steve, some statistical studies, um, and looking at the correlation to kind of um, substorm activity, looking at the heights of Steve, and then I'm going to go into some results that were contributed largely by a citizen scientist who's actually also got a PhD in physics, but not space physics, Michael Hunickel, that worked with us and contributed his own um, insights and collection of a lot of observations on Steve. So the first thing that he noticed was that even though all the rest of us had done a lot of literature search, we had missed that Steve was actually observed and even photographed over 100 years ago by Carl Stormer and his associates across Norway, and even basically researched to the extent that they could at the time. And he called these things feeble homogeneous arcs of great altitude, and also noted that they had an atypical spectra. And you can see some of their black and white observations here. And some of the references. So that is actually somewhat comforting to know that Steve is not new. Michael also took a look at all of the observations that began pouring in from social media and all over when this thing went viral several times, and has compiled some really great lists of many more observations of Steve that do have a lot of quality control. They are useful. They could be used more in conjunction with satellite observations. So I wanted to highlight this specifically. And he has a lot of great stuff in that repository, and a couple of posters and a couple of a lot of stats and a lot of very precise work there. So I'm going to transition now to some of the transient green phenomena. And as I do so, you can see this sort of rough capture of Steve and its little green features by Andy Whitteman, who is a University of Alaska student. And the thing that I see in this is really the fact that, the field lines are not vertical. There's both horizontal and vertical drifts going on, and the structures are really complicated. So we took a look at this with a lot more precise citizen science images in this paper by Joshua Semeter, and specifically found that the green streaks that sometimes accompany the Steve had these tiny little beads or bent structures, specifically bent poleward here, associated with them. And numerous photographers found that these structures are, well, they're not the way aurora is traditionally supposed to occur. So even though the green structure here initially looked much more aurora-like, this is largely a big hint that something could be happening locally that we don't still fully understand. And really interesting plasma physics to continue to unravel. And that's one of the great things about Steve as this boundary. It has, in height and in longitude and in latitude, all kinds of different regions are coming together, and also from the magnetosphere to the ionosphere. It's important to really, people have different views of what's happening, and to reconcile those views. So it's a great boundary structure for that sort of thing. But getting back to the images here, you might notice that these images were taken at different exposure times. And some of the shortest exposure times show that these little structures are actually moving, and so they're getting then smeared out in the longer exposures. And I also wanted to point out that all of these photographs are already quite a bit shorter than the first photographs that found Steve, which were kind of this structure kind of photo bombing the Milky Way, that people were out trying to take relatively long duration photos of the Milky Way. And that's one of the reasons why the structure was showing up much more clearly in their photos than in the all sky cameras. Okay, so then a little bit of further data from the citizen scientists, video data, and showing the evolution of the green structures, streaks. There's a lot of different plasma physics instabilities that could be going on there. There's a recent paper by Matt Zettergren showing some modeling with the Gemini code that tries to get at understanding what some of these what instabilities are happening. So that's a good thing to check out. Um, but yeah, I'm not going to get too much into that, but I will highlight it. Um, yeah, and then just to really briefly show again the fact that exposure in these images can help resolve some of the features that we might have be missing, and to draw your eye here to kind of the whitish structure. When you go down to 1 second exposure, you can see that there's actually more of a ray-like structure here in kind of the whitish mauve part of the Steve. And then even going down to less than a second, you can really start to see some of those streaks and structures as well. And Michael, this observation is one that happened in the southern hemisphere and did quite an extensive analysis that I don't have time to get into, triangulating between multiple observers and really triangulating with a lot of precision about the speed of the white structure that's moving here, as well as getting the height and speed of the picket fence structures. So that's painstaking work that also I think we don't have enough observations of how that what that's telling us. And then lastly, I wanted to transition into some more recent work. These are a couple of screenshots from a time lapse that show how the picket fence can evolve and get rather chaotic towards the end of the Steve observation. So it is important to know, like if you have a satellite conjunction, which part of the Steve you are transiting, and citizen scientist images are and time lapse especially are extremely valuable for that. My recent postdoc, Francesca Damare, has looked at a number of conjunction events and started looking at the turbulent energy cascade within the swarm observations. So these are all events that have swarm observations. And in a paper that we're revising right now, looking at the double slope structure of the turbulent energy cascades, which hasn't been reported before and is part of the turbulent energy cascade. Let's see. Francesca might be on. Oh, Francesca is on. Um, is there anything you want to add to that, Francesca? I'm almost done here, but you could jump in if you like. Sorry to put you on the spot. Maybe we can come back to that. Or you could add more in the chat. I think I've already spoken to most of this about the importance of Steve as a boundary structure, that um, certainly we're still unraveling many aspects of why these things are occurring. And I think the visualizations of what's happening out in the magnetosphere, what's happening in the ionosphere broadly, and then, at these micro scales, all of those things are very difficult to visualize together and model as well. And I think we're progressing on understanding these events with looking at all those aspects and constraining and finding tests of what's happening and how these things are occurring and why they're occurring in certain events. So that's also of interest, and I will also point you all to my post-bac student Faraz Netcha, who's going to be at CEDAR and GEM and presenting not specifically on Steve, but observations of the superstorms from the last year. And so there are some observations relevant for Steve and why we largely don't see Steve during super large storms. Things like that are still actively being looked at. Oh, and I wanted to end with one final, not a Steve observation. And this was from under a month ago, but this thing went viral all over the world, actually, mostly in North America. But this huge plume was seen basically across North America. And this particular screenshot of it doesn't look quite very well, doesn't look that Steve-like, but many people thought it was Steve. However, this was much more of a north-south orientation than Steve. That is this east-west boundary. And this turned out to be a Chinese rocket, that a methane rocket, and it's like exhaust plume. And I will just end on one final note, which is that there is another new project looking at noctilucent clouds. And so folks are also interested in how those might be formed from some of the many rocket launches that we're having nowadays and things like that. So different projects are growing, and I wanted to mention that's exciting and has a lot of overlap as well. Okay, thanks. I hope I'm not over too much time.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Liz, for great introduction on Steve, showcasing the power of citizen science. And let's switch gears now. Our next speaker, Claire Gasquet, she's going to talk to us about aurora-like forms driven by ionospheric parallel electric fields. Please take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Can you see and hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. All right, so thanks, Liz, for giving that great introduction on Steve and the picket fence. It saves me a lot of time. And also, I think it's just fascinating to look at all of those new observations that are coming in, just to remind us of how much we still don't know about these phenomena. So today I'm going to be focusing on mostly a subclass of aurora-like forms, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a minute, that are specifically this green color that, traditionally you see the green aurora and it's created by precipitation, but evidence is suggesting that these green aurora-like forms might be created by something else, specifically ionospheric parallel electric fields, and we'll get into that in a bit. This picture over here obviously is Steve and the picket fence. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the picket fence than Steve, although I will be talking about Steve a little bit in this talk. But then also these other forms. One is called enhanced aurora, which is this sort of brightening in the aurora that you often see near the bottom of the aurora, and this discontinuity in the brightness that you can see. This part of the aurora is greener than expected, and I'll get into that as well. We think it's similar to the picket fence, and then also these fragmented aurora-like emissions, which have been noted in a couple papers and appear on the poleward edge of the aurora, but look remarkably picket fence-like, both in their morphology and then also in the spectra that you see. Okay, so I want to start by just mentioning that, auroral observations have long served in this community in particular as sort of a TV screen for what's happening in the magnetosphere, right? We see the aurora and we use it more or less to trace precipitating particle energy and flux. We use it to learn about ionospheric conductivity enhancements and where those are occurring. There are methods to look at the specific ratios of the colors in the aurora and back out things like the particle energy and the conductivity enhancements. But these new classes of aurora, right, like Steve and the picket fence, potentially enhanced aurora, potentially can be used in a different way and also don't necessarily indicate precipitating particles or conductivity enhancements in the same way. Back in 1998 and also 2005, there was some interest in the enhanced aurora and some initial modeling of it. So this line on the top here is from Carlson and Markland's 1998 paper. And they were modeling sort of a simple up, down, up current system, as you can see here, and showing that essentially in the downward current region, you get this big depletion in the electron density. And they were suggesting that this could be associated actually with the enhanced aurora. So that that enhancement in the aurora is actually tracing a conductivity depletion rather than an enhancement. And I'll show a little bit more about that. And then also, right, with Steve and the picket fence, Steve and the picket fence are associated, right, with those subauroral ion drifts, the extremely fast flows in the ionosphere. And at the same time, you do get a depletion in the conductivity associated with that channel of Steve and the picket fence. And so we're trying to essentially look at these structured upper atmospheric emissions, which are perhaps not directly related to particle precipitation, and seeing if they reveal alternative pathways for magnetospheric energy deposition into the ionosphere-thermosphere system, and potentially could be used to trace conductivity depletions in this environment. Okay, so just to ground this work a little bit, I want to take a little detailed look at some of the spectra of both Steve and the picket fence, talk a little bit about why we don't think they're driven by precipitation, but rather by alternative pathways. And to do that, I'm going to take a look at data from the Transition Region Explorer Network, which is run by the University of Calgary. This is a great network of imagers and spectrographs. In particular, here, I'm going to be looking at the spectrograph imagers, because these wavelength spectra of the aurora-like forms have proven to be a very powerful tool for diagnosing and tracing magnetospheric processes and trying to understand exactly what is driving these forms. So first, I just want to show what sort of a typical auroral spectrum looks like. You can see it here. This is wavelength on the x-axis. There's also a rainbow if you prefer. This is all in the visible spectrum. And just the magnitude of the luminosity is on the y-axis. As you'd expect, a typical green aurora is dominated by this oxygen green line emission. You also have some other emissions mixed into this. You have potentially some oxygen red line, although this tends to happen more at higher altitudes because it's quenched at the lower altitudes. You have some of this these emissions from the N2 first positive system here. And then you also have some of this blue line, which is from the N2 plus first negative system from the ionization of nitrogen, essentially. And each of these, I've mentioned the threshold energies that you need to have a particle colliding with the neutral to create, to excite it and create these emissions. And I'll note that for precipitating particles, especially ones that are getting down to the altitudes of the picket fence, which is around 110 kilometers, particles need hundreds or thousands of EV to get down there. So essentially, for a precipitating particle creating emissions at those altitudes, you're pretty much always going to see these emission lines. In particular, you're always going to get ionization and get these blue line emissions. So then when we look at the spectrum of Steve and the picket fence, they look very different. So I want to start by looking at Steve, because that's particularly interesting, I think. And I'll get into the picket fence a little bit later. But so Steve, right, rather than having those sort of discrete emission lines, is dominated by this continuum of emission. And I think in the last seminar, Cinema Community Science seminar, Zhen Liang went into a good amount of detail on some of the theory for creating continuum emissions, specifically in the aurora. But that's also what we're seeing predominantly in Steve to create that kind of whitish color. There's a bit of this oxygen red line in there as well. There may or may not be green line, but it's dominated by this continuum of emission that you see. And I've noted, the continuum is from question mark, because it's actually still a bit of an open question exactly what is creating these emissions. There are some theories, and like I mentioned in the last seminar, Zhen Liang talked a little bit about them. In Steve right now, the only current theory that's been published here is a paper by my colleague Brian Harding in 2020. And that was talking about how those fast-flowing ions in the SAID channel could collide with the ambient atmosphere and create sort of a chemical cascade that could lead to that continuum of emission. Specifically, he was suggesting that you have the fast-flowing ions, they're colliding with nitrogen and vibrationally exciting it. And you have to have sort of high levels of vibrational excited nitrogen to overcome the activation energy for this reaction to create nitric oxide. And then that nitric oxide, if you have enough of it, could combine with ambient oxygen to produce NO2 and that spectrally broad continuum emission. Unfortunately, there are some problems with that theory. Zhen Liang brought up again in his previous talk that if you do a detailed quantum calculation of the collisions between these ions and the ambient nitrogen, you don't actually get quite enough of this vibrationally excited N2 from that mechanism alone. On top of that, this is high resolution imagery of Steve, where you can see there's a lot of substructure going on. And the emission timescales from that theory of Steve predict that it should be actually a much smoother arc with a lot less of this substructure. Which is to say that there are still some things that we're working on. And I'd actually encourage you all to come to Brian Harding's talk in the continuum session at CEDAR Gem to hear a little bit about more of what we're working on in regards to this. But for now, I want to move back to the green aurora-like forms and the picket fence. And just summarize that to say that Steve emissions are not thought to be due to precipitation, but the specific chemistry of the generation mechanism is still a bit of a mystery, as well as the thresholding behavior, how fast of a flow you need, all of that. But what about the picket fence? So going back to the spectrum that we had, this is the spectrum of the picket fence. And so unsurprisingly, right, the picket fence you have is predominantly green. And the dominant feature by far that you see is this oxygen green line. You have a hint of the N2 first positive. You don't have any of the oxygen red line, although this is at a lower altitude, so that's more or less expected due to quenching. But one of the things that tipped us off that the picket fence is also not created by precipitation is the lack of the N2 plus first negative emissions. As I mentioned, precipitating particles reaching these altitudes should be energetic enough essentially to create these emissions. The fact that we don't see them suggests that it's more likely to be a local acceleration process that is energizing the electrons to create these emissions. Essentially, that is to say that the picket fence is unusually green. And so it's more likely that we have a local superthermal electron population, which has energies between the threshold energy of the oxygen green line and this threshold energy for the N2 plus first negative emissions to create this rather than particle precipitation. To look at this more closely, we wanted to look at it a little more systematically. We took multiple observations from of the picket fence from the T-Rex spectrograph at Lucky Lake in Canada. We looked at the ratio between that green line brightness and the N2 first positive brightness, noting that for all of these examples, we didn't have any of that N2 plus first negative emission. And we wanted to see if a model driven by those parallel electric fields, which I mentioned earlier, could replicate this observed ratio between these emissions while also not producing any of those blue line emissions. And so to do that, we essentially put together a kinetic model where we had a realistic ionosphere and thermosphere, and we could input different parallel electric field strengths and then do a kinetic calculation to see what is the electron energy distribution function, which is to say, do we have electrons that are stretching up to higher energies enough to excite the neutrals and create some of these emissions? And what we found is that as you're turning up this parallel electric field strength, you're stretching essentially the tail of this electron energy distribution function to higher and higher energies. And as you're turning it up enough, right, you're starting to intersect these cross sections for electron impact excitation. And if you turn up the electric field high enough, right, then you actually do start to ionize the local atmosphere, and you produce those emissions from ionization. So it kind of creates a natural threshold above which, you know, we wouldn't expect to see fields. But the question was, can we reproduce that observed ratio of the green line to N2 first positive? Based on our modeling, right, this was looking at the parallel electric field strength. This is as a function of altitude. We're really focusing here at about 110 kilometers where we're seeing the picket fence emissions. This is plotting that ratio between N2 first positive and green line. And the observed ratio is this dotted line that you see on here. And essentially we found that at that altitude, about 110, where you expect to see the picket fence, we did find that the specific emission ratio that we were observing in the picket fence with the T-Rex spectrograph could be produced if you do have electric fields of about 80 to 150 millivolts per meter at that altitude. Those are very high electric fields, and they have never been measured before, but it's not implausible to say. So that is to say that this parallel electric fields hypothesis is viable. It's a viable alternative to particle precipitation. I want to talk a little bit more about enhanced aurora in particular. We just recently got funded to look at how enhanced aurora might be similar to the picket fence in terms of being driven by potentially parallel electric fields rather than particle precipitation. So I'll mention again, so this was one of the first papers that looked at enhanced aurora. This is a paper by Tom Hallinan. And so this enhanced aurora, again, it's this sharply defined layer that's typically very narrow and near the bottom of an arc. It's about 1 to 15 kilometers tall, and it has increased luminosity compared to the rest of the arc with this real discontinuity in the brightness, which can't be necessarily explained by precipitation, these discontinuities. And it is thought, based on Hallinan's statistics back in the 80s and 90s, it's thought to occur up to 50% of the time that aurora is observed, which makes it a prime subject for studying the physics of these green aurora-like forms if it's formed in the same way as the picket fence. Because Steve and the picket fence are relatively rare compared to the normal aurora. And so what we're undertaking to do now is a broader survey of this enhanced aurora, again, using the T-Rex network. We only have preliminary results of this right now. We're continuing to work on it. But essentially, we're trying to target this, the green to blue ratio in the aurora to see if we can use that to uncover these enhancements. Just like the picket fence, enhanced aurora has been observed to be too greener than it should be compared to the normal aurora, which is to say that it doesn't have as much of the blue from the ionization of nitrogen as it would be expected to. And so we're going to try to use that to pinpoint examples of these and see if we can get a larger and more comprehensive statistical study of what's going on. At the same time, we're also, we have some preliminary modeling results. This is using Gemini. We're working with the folks at Embry-Riddle. So far, we've gone ahead and replicated the work from Carlson et al. 2005, where they were driving the ionosphere with a simple up-down-up current system, which is pretty narrow, as you can see from the scale here. Here, the color scale is the electron density, and these contours represent the current contours. This is the beginning of the simulation, and this is a little ways into the simulation. You can see that we have this development of the conductivity depletion, as I was talking about earlier. And simultaneously, if we take a slice through this and look at the parallel electric field strength, this is the parallel electric field profile that Gemini predicts. And so you can see that, first of all, Gemini does predict that there will be a parallel electric field that forms in this conductivity depletion region. And at least in this example, right, it had magnitudes of tens of millivolts per meter. This is not quite as high as what we were predicting to get the color ratios in the picket fence, but it's a starting point, and we're going to be doing a lot more work on this in the coming years. So please do check back if you're interested. So in terms of implications and big takeaways, I want to highlight, first of all, that doing an in-depth sort of quantitative analysis of these optical spectra provides a powerful tool for really diagnosing these processes in terms of exactly what is creating the light and then how we can connect that to what's going on in the magnetosphere. When folks are proposing mechanisms for how to get these emissions, how to get the structures, I think it's important to always make sure that they are sort of quantitatively in agreement with the observations in terms of the light that's being seen. And so those are the tools that we've been trying to develop. Additionally, right, those green aurora-like forms might be driven by those parallel electric fields in the collisional base of the ionosphere, specifically which are created in conductivity depletion regions as a way to maintain current continuity, to continue to drive the currents through the ionosphere in those low conductivity areas. And then with that additional electrodynamic modeling, we're hoping that this might lead to a method to detect and or parameterize conductivity depletions associated with MIT coupling for larger models. And that is work that is still in progress. So I just also want to highlight that, as you've probably seen throughout this talk, we still have a lot of open questions here that we're working on. One of them or some of them that we're actively working on are, what are the patterns of those current drivers at the upper boundary that can drive sufficiently large parallel electric fields to energize those local electrons and produce these forms? Right now, we're just looking at, so we're not specifically looking at the roles of instabilities or turbulence. We're just looking at sort of the direct parallel electric field that's formed, but it's likely that we'll find that that is not sufficient to create these forms. And we'll need to introduce some more mechanisms as well. Similarly, we want to look at sort of how much heating this might introduce into the ionosphere. This parallel electric field, right, if it exists, which again still has not been measured, would essentially represent true Joule heating, right? It's an electric field imparting energy directly to the electrons in the plasma here. And so a question would be, right, what is the relative role of this true Joule heating from E parallel and the more traditional frictional heating in that electromagnetic energy dissipation associated with green aurora-like forms, and trying to figure out how well we can trace those with those optical observations. So I'll stop there so that we have plenty of time for questions. If you're interested in the paper that some of this was based on, you can find it here. Here's my email. But otherwise, thank you all for listening, and thanks to the organizers of this seminar series for this chance to talk.
Thank you so much, Claire. What very interesting talk. And folks, we have a lot of time for questions and discussion. Please unmute yourself or virtually raise hand. Robin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a question for Liz, but Claire may have a thought as well. Liz, you mentioned the boundary structures and then kind of alluded to what's happening out in the magnetosphere, and I was wondering, do we have any idea of where these Steve structures map to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because it's subauroral, it's closer in, but it's also kind of a boundary that is associated with substorms and fast flows. And then is Toshi on here? Toshi has a really nice paper showing kind of that some of these substorms associated more with Steve might be kind of a little more on the westward side of the magnetotail, and I'm probably not saying that entirely correctly, but that there could be something a little different about those substorms. And actually, yeah, others could jump in. This would be a great question.
So this is still equator word of substorm onset, right? So inward of where the actual onset is happening, is that
Yeah, equatorward.
equatorward? Yeah.
But after the substorm onset, right?
Okay.
So particles and flow are coming in and then kind of diverting around and influencing this where you get this strong westward flow. So maybe others can describe it more clearly, but I think that is where it gets tricky to describe as well. Actually, yeah, for me, in simple language, but yeah.
They seem to be inside of the electron precipitation region. I mean, more equator because that's where all the SAIDs occur. There is low conductivity in the ionosphere.
Right?
I mean, that was my picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Claire, did you want to add more or say it
No, you
differently
did
better?
you did a great job.
Bea, maybe? Anybody?
More comments, questions? I have a quick question for Claire. So about picket fence, right? So the remote observations suggest the absence of high energy particle precipitation, but I guess it would be helpful to have some conjugate observations with in situ measurements that could resolve the lack of or the existence of precipitation at the same time. Did you look at any conjugate data with picket fence like Elfin or something else?
That's not something we've looked at yet. Specifically with this, I mentioned we just got funded to look more at the enhanced aurora, and we're hoping to do something with the enhanced aurora, potentially with DMSP or Elfin, to look at precipitation and then look at essentially the spectrum at the same time and see if we can distinguish, this component that's created by particle precipitation versus created by potentially something else, something that's missing. The problem is that there is a good amount of error in these kinds of models, and we're working now to see, can we conclusively say anything, or do we not have precise enough measurements to be able to do that?
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, please.
Do you know, is the enhanced aurora similarly at like 110 kilometers or more like the picket fence, or do you know if the modeling predicts the 110 specifically? Picket
So
fence?
observationally, it's at the bottom of auroral arcs, so around 100, 110. Modeling wise, in terms of, are you asking about like the altitude at which we would get the parallel electric fields? Or something
Yeah,
else?
I'm asking if the fact that it's not 100, but 110 or so is predicted by, it might be more of by like Brian's theory, or by things we know about chemistry or density or electric fields.
Yeah, so Brian's theory is more looking at Steve itself, not the picket fence and enhanced aurora. And I guess I would encourage you to come to his talk at CEDAR Gem to talk more about that. In terms of predicting the altitude of the picket fence, right now we're looking at, again, where you get those parallel electric fields. The preliminary Gemini simulation that we had actually had the strongest field occurring a little bit at a higher altitude than where we would see the picket fence. But these altitudinal considerations, I think, are one of the most interesting questions here in terms of the thresholding behavior between, where you're getting Steve, where you're getting the picket fence, and how the chemistry is changing with altitude. I think that'll unlock a lot of answers if we can look into it more fully.
How big are the structures, the picket fence structuring in kilometers? Do we know?
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer off the top of my head. Because there's the different structures. I think the Summitter paper, which I haven't looked at in a little while, probably has quite a bit of a better
But is
answer.
it like kilometer, 10 kilometers, sort of that scale?
Yes, and then the teeny little things
Okay.
as well.
More comments, questions? If not, I would like to thank both speakers again for talking about different aspects of low-latitude aurora. Quite fascinating indeed. And quick announcement, folks, we will be taking a break for the rest of the summer. And please follow the email announcements, and we plan on resuming the seminars sometime in the beginning of September. So if you have any suggestions on speakers and or any other sort of comments on how we run these seminars, please let us know. We'll greatly appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see some of you at the GEM meeting. Thanks a lot, and we will resume this in a couple of months.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.